So I've been asking you guys if there are any psychology related books that you want me to review on this channel or to fact check psychologically. And recently somebody asked me to read The Completion Process by Teal Swan. So in this video, that's what I'm going to be doing. I'm going to be reviewing the contents of this book. I do want to clarify this is just going to be limited to the contents of this book. I'm not really going to be addressing the other claims against Teal. I know that people say she's a cult leader. That's honestly not something that I'm super informed on, so I'm not going to speculate about it. And in general, I'd say I'm pretty agnostic to Teal Swan. I've watched some of her videos over the years, not too many. I find her to be quite insightful in many ways and other times a little bit rigid and ego-driven in her teachings, but I really don't have as strong feelings about her as a lot of people do who either adore her or hate her guts. So with all of that said, let's talk about the completion process. So the book starts with an introduction where she is briefly narrating how she was a victim of ritual abuse for 13 years as a child and how this led to her sort of what I would call acceptance epiphany, her realization that she needs to release resistance to her own emotions. Now, as a rule, when somebody tells me that they were a victim, I typically believe them. False abuse reports are remarkably rare, and disbelieving someone who says they were victimized can be really harmful. However, since repressed memories are one of the more recurring motifs in this book that I actually have some concerns about, I do want to flag something. From the information I could gather, it looks like Teal Swan unearthed this memory of her experiencing ritual abuse while working with therapist Barbara Snow, who was a central figure in the Utah satanic panic of the late 20th century. The Utah County Chief Deputy Attorney testified that he actually observed Snow coaching children through a two-way mirror. Judy Pugh, a colleague of Snow's, told the court that she was concerned about how children's stories would homogeneously emerge after interviews with Snow. One 10-year-old girl testified that Snow asked her as many as 50 times in one session if the accused had touched her, and that she finally relented only when she became afraid that Snow would yell at her otherwise. Now, in the case of Teal Swan specifically, the abuse allegations that Snow reported on Teal's behalf ended due to lack of evidence. But look, I'm not going to speculate on the validity of Teal Swan's ritual abuse claim. What I will do is I want to talk about some of my concerns about unearthing repressed memories more broadly and in greater depth later in this video. Anyway, the introduction ends with Teal Swan talking about how this acceptance of her own emotions epiphany basically led to what she now calls the completion process. So in part one of the book, Teal kind of sets up the theoretical groundwork for the completion process. And in this section, I actually found myself agreeing with a majority of what Teal Swan wrote. She's clearly quite well versed in what trauma looks like, what an emotional trigger is, how emotions are messengers and not something to be banished, the importance of being open with your emotions without any sort of resistance, what projection is, what dissociation is, the long-term harm of emotionally invalidating a child, and the fact that many therapists are nowadays switching the focus from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. This is something that is absolutely happening within the field of psychology. Now, there were other parts of this section where Teal seems to understand the concepts she's talking about, but she also kind of conflates and confuses them with other concepts, kind of revealing her lack of formal training in psychology. So she refers to the unconscious mind as the subconscious mind. The two are technically different within psychoanalytic and psychodynamic circles. What she's talking about is the unconscious rather than the subconscious. At one point, she's basically describing the Jungian shadow self, though she doesn't call it that, she calls it the rejected self. And she also says we could call the subconscious the shadow, which actually is not true because the subconscious she's referring to is again called the unconscious. And the shadow is a Jungian term that refers to what she calls the rejected self. At least she does later quote Carl Jung. I don't know why she doesn't give him credit for all the concepts that she derived from his work. But this is something that I noticed throughout the book, that there were a lot of things that were derivative of theories that are already in existence that she didn't seem to credit and kind of took responsibility for as if they were her original ideas. Now, from what I understand, there are other people that she's done this with outside the field of psychology, more like spiritual teachers, and that I'm honestly not as well versed in, but there have been some plagiarism claims against her. Teal also talks about how trauma suppresses certain emotions, and here I think she means repression, not suppression. Suppression is when you consciously push something down, repression is when you unconsciously push it down. So something like trauma causing amnesia would be an example of repression, not suppression. Now, despite this, there was one part that I really loved where Teal was talking about how when people seem like they're being dramatic, it's essentially because they're experiencing a different reality than you. And this is something that I kind of explored in my video analyzing, are all emotions valid? Basically, my answer is all emotions are valid in the sense that there's nothing wrong with the emotions that come up. You know, the emotions always serve a purpose. They're always there to be messengers. However, not all emotions fit the facts of the situation because sometimes we have distortions about what's going on in the situation. And I think this is really just a different way of saying what Teal Swan is saying in this passage when she says the meaning they have assigned to a situation is more painful than the meaning you have assigned to the situation. And she gives a really good illustrative example where she's talking about how a wife forgets to put on her wedding band after washing her hands, and her husband freaks out on her and she thinks that he's being dramatic. Well, from her perspective, it was just a simple mistake of, I forgot to put my wedding band on. But from her husband's perspective, his reality is the reality of my wife no longer loves me. My wife wants to seem single. Even if that is based on a distortion, even if it's not based on the facts of the situation, in that moment, both of their emotions are valid in the realities within which they operate. And this reminds me of a comment I got about how within logic, for something to be valid means it's sound based on its underlying assumptions. So if the assumption is, this is my reality, then yeah, your emotion is valid if that is your reality. That doesn't make any sort of evaluation on whether the assumptions are correct or not. Now, where I start to disagree with Teal is in the chapter on making the subconscious conscious. And this is where she seems to be borrowing from Carl Jung's quote without really crediting him. His quote is, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." This is where she starts to say that the behavioral programming in the subconscious mind is acquired during the formative period between gestation and 8 years of age. And here I'm just kind of like, source, explanation, like what's the argument exactly here? Because yes, it's true that like children are like sponges and those early experiences do set the foundation for the rest of their lives. It's also true that those earlier memories are not consolidated. Children do not have the capacity to fully form memory until later on in childhood, something called infantile amnesia. And so that's why those earlier memories are therefore stored in the unconscious and sometimes in the body itself where they're out of reach. It's why, for instance, if when you were a little child you were chastised a lot for making a simple mistake, you might not remember that, but your body automatically goes into fight or flight when you accidentally make a small mistake as an adult. However, this doesn't prove Teal's statement that we don't experience any new emotional traumas after about age 8, that any emotional traumas we experience are just reactivations of prior wounds, or her statement that any current emotional upset is in fact just the echo of a traumatic memory. If a person is in a traumatic car accident at age 22 or a natural disaster at age 60, their trauma reaction does not mean something from childhood got activated. Trauma can occur at any age. Emotional wounds can appear at any age. New triggers can pop up whenever. Emotions exist to help us survive. Often their message has not so much to do with the past, but rather what's happening in the present moment that needs our attention. Let me give you an example. Let's say that I am the most popular person in the world. I have absolutely no history of rejection trauma or anything near it. But the moment that someone rejects me in a painful way as an adult, I'm still going to feel a painful emotion because my emotional circuitry as a human being is trying to signal something that requires my attention. It's saying, hey, watch out. If people start rejecting you, they might push you out of the tribe, and then you'll have to fend for yourself and you might not make it. So when we feel a painful emotion or a wound or a trigger, it's not necessarily because something from our past has gotten triggered. It's that something in our present requires our attention. Now, the seed of truth in what Teal is saying is that if you don't have a history of rejection trauma, it's probably going to hurt a lot less than if you do. If you do have a history of rejection trauma, your emotional reaction might be a lot more disproportionate. But regardless, in either of those two situations, it's still going to hurt because all emotions exist to help us survive in the moment. So I just really don't understand her argument here that basically all emotional wounds happen before age 8. There's not any evidence to support this from what she says or from what I know of the literature. Now, in part 2, Teal Swan goes into the actual completion process. And on one hand, Teal encourages people to seek professional support while trying this process. She tells them to seek help immediately if they feel tempted to harm themselves or others, which I think is responsible, and I commend her for saying that. However, she also later recommends engaging a completion process certified practitioner. If you are in imminent danger, you need to go to the ER to call up your therapist or your doctor, not somebody who is certified in something that's unregulated. She also explicitly mentions at a few points throughout the book that she loves using this process to help people struggling with mental illness, addictions, weight issues, chronic or terminal illness, or who are recovering from CSA specifically. She also says helping individuals with PTSD is a particular passion of mine. She says that she has a particular passion also for working with incarcerated individuals. And the issue here is that a lot of these are very vulnerable populations. Licensed professionals and evidence-based treatment modalities exist to protect the general public, particularly the most vulnerable within the general public. And listen, I can understand that sometimes people have medical trauma, therefore they don't trust the establishment of medicine. I myself don't agree 100% with everything that's popular within the field of psychology right now, or with 100% of the APA's ethical guidelines even. I understand why people turn to alternative medicine, and if it helps them more than mainstream medicine could, even anecdotally, then that's great. We have one extra person who's doing fine. The way I see it, just because their specific situation isn't generalizable to the public as a whole, doesn't mean it's not a good thing that they found healing in that alternative medicine. However, you have to understand how these governing bodies are there to protect you. Teal herself might be a wonderful unlicensed emotional healer, but not everyone is. No, the system is not perfect, and yes, there are also unethical people within the system, but the good part about having a disciplinary system is that unethical therapists experience consequences. Without that, the general public is extremely vulnerable to abuse. To give you a concrete example, so recently I made a video on reacting to estranged parent TikToks, and one of them was what I thought was somebody implying that they were a therapist because they said they work with people's emotions. And I didn't want to be rude. I didn't want to, question somebody's qualifications without evidence. But I think a lot of you noticed that I was a little skeptical about that person's qualifications because of the way she was approaching the topic at hand and because of how inconsistent her recommendations were with what most therapists would consider to be a good idea. One thing in particular that I had said was that her argument could be weaponized by abusive parents to validate themselves when they experience estrangement from their children. And that's actually exactly what happened. If you look at the comments under her video, if you look at the people who are reposting and stitching her video, it seems like that's what was going on. But even though I couldn't find anything about that person's name or her so-called qualifications, I did go back to her account and I found out that she's been using the hashtag emotional health coach on a bunch of her videos. That to me kind of said it all. I was like, okay, so you're probably not like a licensed therapist. You're probably one of those unregulated coaches. And that is exactly the issue with having unregulated coaches and unregulated healing practitioners, is that there will be people who are not following a set of guidelines, who are not following what's considered evidence-based treatment modalities, and who then cause a lot of harm to people. So I want any readers of Teal's book or consumers of her content to be aware of the risk when they are engaging in what's essentially unlicensed, unregulated therapy. Now, some people say, oh no, it's not technically therapy. I'm sorry, we're going to have to agree to disagree. If you're working with people's emotional health, if you are guiding people through the process of emotional acceptance or working through traumatic memories with PTSD patients, That is essentially therapy, what you're trying to do. Now, moving into what the completion process actually is, it has 18 steps, but I'm just going to summarize kind of the main beats of it, the main gist. Create a safe haven, which is basically like a positive visualization technique where you imagine like the safest possible place you can imagine. This was actually quite soothing. I did it. I enjoyed it. Then she recommends something called emotional vipassana, which is sinking into the feeling or trigger. It's basically a form of emotional mindfulness or acceptance from what I could gather. Then she says you have to validate the feeling and you have to invite the memory to surface. You have to ask yourself, when was the first time I felt this feeling? And then to re-experience the memory and to validate the feeling. To step in as an adult, to validate the inner child. To let the child decide what they need. Do they want to come with you to the safe haven? Do they want to punch the abuser in their memory? What would they prefer to do? And then she says you have to deactivate the memory and you have to visualize a purification ritual for the inner child. And in the end, you give the child an option. Do you want to stay in the safe haven? Or do you want to merge with my current self? Now, there's lots to love here. I love the idea of self-validation, of imagining yourself as an adult, providing to your inner child what no one could, the positive visualization aspect of the safe haven, of the purification ritual. But there are also a couple things about this process that do really concern me. The most flagrant one is the idea of revisiting repressed memories. Now, if a memory naturally comes up while you're doing this process, then great, I have no issue with going through the steps that she suggested. But there are points where she kind of seems to suggest digging, trying to pull a memory, even if no memory organically comes up. So the thing you have to understand is that children gradually begin to encode long-term memories as they grow up. Before that, they experience something called infantile amnesia. And this is for a few different reasons. For one, the hippocampus, the part of the brain which is basically responsible for encoding memories, is not fully developed when you're a child. Neural connections are not yet established. Children's brains are in a different brainwave state than adults are. Children typically have the brainwaves typically associated with hypnosis and meditating. And also there's a theory that language development is a necessary precursor to encoding memories, meaning that because young children lack a full vocabulary, they physically cannot preserve those memories. So keep this in mind when Teal writes, for instance, she went back into a memory of being 1 year old, and even then she could see she was a victim of ritual trauma and incest. I'm sorry, but that is not physically possible. Repressed unconscious trauma does exist, and I have no doubts that if that happened to someone, it would impact them as an adult, even if they don't remember it. But unfortunately, a memory is physically incapable of being extracted from the unconscious to the conscious if it occurred before about age 3. Memories are not retained before that age because of the developmental reasons I mentioned earlier. So when repressed traumas come up, they must do so naturally, organically, without any sort of coercion or influence from other people. It's why when screening for child abuse, for instance, trauma-informed therapy says that you must never ask leading questions like, did you experience this? Or where did you experience this? It has to be completely open-ended questions like, tell me about what you experienced. Because memories are very easy to plant. For example, in 2002, there was a study where researchers showed participants altered photos of them doing things that never actually happened, like taking a hot air balloon ride. Participants were then asked to recall specific details of these fabricated events, and over 50% of them developed either partial or full details of this memory that never happened. In 1996, there was something called the imagination inflation study, where participants were asked to imagine specific events, and later they were asked if they remembered those events happening. Participants were more likely to report false memories of imagined events as real after multiple imagination exercises. And the conclusion of the researchers was that simply imagining an event increases your likelihood of developing a false memory of it. So trying to go into this meditative state and to visualize something that may or may not have happened to you is a really good way of getting people to report false memories. In 1995, there was also the false memory for words list, where participants were given lists of semantically related words like bed, rest, or pillow, but they were not shown a critical word that connected them together, like sleep in the situation. And later, when participants were asked to recall the words, many of them falsely remembered seeing the critical word that connected them, which was sleep. Encouraging people to force themselves to remember a traumatic memory until they do is not trauma-informed therapy. It's extremely dangerous, and it's exactly why Teal Swan's own therapist, Barbara Snow, got into hot waters with her peers. Like I said, if a childhood memory naturally comes up when you're trying to meditate on a painful emotion, then I don't see the harm in going through the process she's suggesting. But trying to force a memory to come up, either for yourself or for someone else, is extremely dangerous. And a less serious qualm that I have with this process, but that is still a criticism I have, is why do we even need the step of erasing the memory? I would argue that emotional acceptance also involves acceptance of the painful reality that occurred, not trying to rewrite it or deactivate it. Teal seems to claim that if you do this process correctly and enough times, you will no longer be triggered or experience any sort of wounds related to the original trauma. In my opinion, true healing is being able to sit with your trauma history and to say, yes, this happened. It was very painful. I sometimes still find myself experiencing moments of pain because of it, but I'm at a place right now where I can just pass through those temporary moments of pain without resistance, without turning it into suffering. And also that those moments happen less frequently and with less intensity. That to me is healing, not let's completely rewrite this traumatic history that happened. And in part 3, Teal gives a lot of testimonials of how the completion process healed different people. One man, for example, she says, had treatment-resistant cancer and went into remission after a few months of using this process. Another woman overcame medication, substances, and binge eating disorder with it. And I get the impression that this section is, like in many New Age self-help books, kind of an advertisement to the author's one-on-one services. I'm glad that these individuals found healing, but again, it's important to test out treatment methods using randomized control trials in order to determine, are they actually safe to recommend to the general public? So in summary, I think Teal Swan is very well versed in many psychological concepts, particularly more psychodynamic ones, although her lack of formal training in psychology does sometimes reveal itself in the way she conflates terms and the way she seems to take responsibility for theories that are already well established. I completely agree with her stance on emotional openness and acceptance of all emotions. I also agree that the concept of the inner child can be very helpful for fostering self-compassion, for overcoming childhood trauma. Where I start to really disagree is the notion that all emotional triggers are caused by original wounds that occurred before the age of 8. I just don't understand her argument for this. And her proposed method for unearthing these repressed wounds can be quite dangerous. It ignores the body of evidence we have to suggest that memory is deeply flawed and susceptible to manipulation, and specifically memory before the age of 3 is not retained. So you cannot, unfortunately, pull out an unconscious memory before that age. Also, if the goal is full emotional acceptance, why not also accept the fact that these events happened? Why the need to rewrite them, to deactivate them? And I also have some concerns about the fact that Teal Swan explicitly wrote she enjoys working with some of the most vulnerable populations, like trauma victims, incarcerated individuals, people with depression and eating disorders, considering she is not a licensed mental health professional and her completion process is not evidence-based treatment. I did find that the completion process was derivative of certain psychological theories that already exist, without credit given to them, kind of framed as if Teal had discovered all of this on her own. I'm not an expert in the content that other people say she's plagiarizing, but given her willingness to position her ideas as original and also as a holy grail in her words, that's not something that altogether surprises me. So those were my thoughts on The Completion Process by Teal Swan. If you've read the book or if you've just watched this video, I'd be curious to hear what you think about what I had to say. I hope you take care, and I'll see you soon.